Alright, so this is actually a reshoot. Is the last video I did, I ended up talking for a good hour, and then there was like a police chase outside and just a lot of distractions. So, anyway, what did I cover in the last one? So I think mostly as I was talking about the modification now on the roof. Like in the original video, I didn't really talk about the roof at all, like what I was cutting, if I was going to cut it at all. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Maybe a little bit more about my reverse fins there on the back of the valve guide. On my last video, you can see more about reverse swirl fins or Elkins fins, whatever, and some of their advantages. I get into that, like how to cut that. Like it is a little bit tricky at some points because, of course, I have the egg on it, but like some of the burrs, like the spherical, does still have a cutting surface on the tip, so at some points you do have to kind of almost go completely vertical with this, whereas on the inside portion of the bowl is you can get in, you know, from the port and kind of work that side a little bit there. So it is a little tricky, but with a little patience is you can get the shape out. So if you watch my last video, you can read that, or just Google like reverse swirl fins, and you should come on a thread of like NASCAR head developers and Winston Cup, like guys that really know the science involved behind, you know, like port energy, velocity, swirl, etc., like everything going into it. So anyway, let me get into first, I'll get into the what's going on here with the modification. And so if you know before, actually let's look at, because this third port is actually in progress. They're all working on being cloned up, but here is like a stock roof, and some of the gunk is kind of throwing off the light reflection. And when I posted phone photos of this change, it definitely makes it look a lot deeper. But basically all I'm doing to the roof, and these is, and you can probably see what's going on. You see, basically I'm just focused on the sides, and then that kind of comes out to kind of like a wedge or an arrow, basically from the valve guide boss coming in through the tunnel. That's basically done with my 1/4 inch egg here, the 500 thousandths. And it's not just like one, and it's not from the bowl. I'm gonna flip these over in a second, but basically it's about a couple of widths toward the port entry, right? Toward the valve guide, like you can really only fit one, and it's not as deep as it looks on camera. It's actually only a change of about 30 thousandths. So if you remember, I cut the short side radius and floor from a 1.225 to like a GT40P spec, which is about a 1.340. These come in at about like 333 thousandths. So that's just kind of where they landed, and I didn't really want to mess with it too much more. Getting into like that's not totally unsafe toward the water jacket. That's still decent, but it's also to keep, you know, velocity in mind, being that these are still a 178 valve. So in those grooves now in the roof along the sides, that again taper out. There we go, there's a good shot. That basically opens up to about a 1 370 thousandths inch. So not a huge change. It was kind of like just instinctive. I guess you could call it some guesswork. To that I wouldn't lose like too much velocity by opening it that large. So originally I never mentioned doing this cut. I know that I mentioned like everything that I would be doing. I just wasn't certain, but I kind of felt like it would be okay, considering the size of the short side and stuff. And again, keep in mind that a GT40P is... I think the exhaust valves are the same. I could even be wrong about that, because that doesn't... They're a what, a 1.8 or a 1.9 valve? And maybe they're a 1.6 exhaust? Because that wouldn't make sense that the exhaust is still a 1.46, because you're supposed to be within like 70-75% of valve sizes. I think to still run a single pattern cam, like meaning that your lifts are the same. So that's like why there's a dual pattern cam. Like, for example, on this particular engine and cam, my lift on the exhaust is like 20 thousandths higher, and then the duration is like, you know, like 10 points, not points, but you get what I mean, thousandths different, or degrees different rather, with the duration. Like the scavenge plateau helps with that, but that's why you have a dual pattern cam. Depends on the head and everything. I think that may be why people don't like letter cams, because those are a single pattern, and I don't think they're optimal for the size difference. Like, I think on the extreme side would be like where you're really hurting would be like if you had a 202 valve for your intake and then like a 146 for exhaust. I don't think anyone has done that, but it's just a point. Anyway, so I think that should be okay, just taking a little out. I just felt that it could probably be opened up more. What else? See, now I'm trying to remember everything I covered in the video that was way too long, but these are almost done. The bowls are mostly done, at least around the valve guide. Like, I still will have to texture it. And remember in the very first video, what I mentioned is when you start doing this, it's good to do, well, for all 8 cylinders, I did do the thermactor cuts and the pushrod bulge cut. And remember, on these, they're biased toward the roof. But what I did was, like, I got all of those out of the way, but once you get into one of the heads, it's a good rule of thumb to, like, I know I've already said this, but I'm just mentioning it again to make a point about how these are going. But, you know, you want to, like, make a cut and then go to the next chamber. So whether you're focused on the short side and floor, your short turn and dogleg, whatever the work happens to be, is I think that it works best, at least for me, to do like one cut at a time for your muscle memory and just knowing that you did it. So, like, you know, you do finish the short side, get that mic'd out, and then you move to the next one and get that blended and mic'd out and everything. Scavenge plateaus here. These are just rough cut. Those aren't done. I know those look pretty terrible, but you know, same with the, I mean, you get the idea. I don't have to go through each step, but valve guides and certain things, you may be cheating that type of rule a little differently, because it's one of those things where what I like to do when I'm working on a cut is I'll work on 2 at a time. And the reason that is because it sometimes is easier to change one while you're changing another so that they're a little more cloned. Where you might find that you forget exactly how you did something or what burr you used. So I try to go like back and forth, and then I'll go to a third one. But I do try certain things like 2 at a time, but on the same focus. So, like, you know, I'll focus on the outside of that valve guide to get that fin in there, and so on. And what you'll find is if you're doing this properly, is then they should all have the same imperfection or things that you haven't gotten to. Like, for example, on these, well, I think I actually did blend those out because I made a video before I poured it. No, it's still there. But like right here, where I'm supposed to be kind of hipping around the valve a little bit, like, you know, this comes down and out a little bit, I can still feel this little bulge that needs to be blended in. So that should be present. If you're doing this how I just said, that'll be present on each of these bowls. So then you know, okay, like going step by step, now I know this needs to change. And you'll have things in between where that's not the case, and you know, like like something may end up a little misshapen. Like right now, looking at, you know, the outside diameter of the guides, like they're a little bit different. The third one here isn't completely done, and these have all been shaved down in height. Like here's a stock height one, and these come down a little under 100,000ths of an inch. What else? So that's like kind of, you know, how I do it. I just wanted to like touch in again with, you know, the fact that I made a cut to the roof. If you were following and you're trying to like clone what I'm doing with hard measurements, I was showing that. But I'm going to try to like power through these. Obviously, I haven't even gotten to the exhaust yet, but the intake is just a little bit trickier. And I don't want to say that it's more important, but I feel like for the exhaust is you're really just kind of opening up the bowl. This side from the factory, the exhaust outboard side is a little bit bigger, so that gets opened up. But I think mostly on the exhaust is, well, there's a really terrible ridge there that's going to get blended and smoothed out, but I feel like for a stock valve exhaust, it's mostly just doing that, then the short side, and having a scavenge plateau. Then obviously your thermactor will be gone, but I'll get more into that as I go. But other than that is I'm pretty confident in these. Like the first pair I did were okay as far as how the intake looked. Like I went through similar steps, but this time around I was more prepared with technique and kind of knew more what I was doing and objectives as far as like velocity, and this time like thinking about swirl, which I don't know how much the reverse swirl fin is really gonna bring. Like this helps a little bit, like these cuts, but I'm not certain it's gonna, like, you'll have to go back to my last video. I'm not gonna ramble about the benefit of a reverse swirl fin or an Elkins fin. But here's some thoughts that I had that I mentioned on the last video, though, about why to do this. Like, yeah, this particular engine build, these heads will hopefully flow on the intake, you know, over 200 CFM with stock valves and basically a 3/4 cam, like a cam that's just under 500,000ths inch lift. High duration on a dual pattern, like I mentioned, but the thing is, like, this will definitely support over 400 horsepower. My build's not going to quite be making that. I'm hoping to get as close as I can to 400 in foot-pounds, which is still a tall order for a little 5.0. But here's the thing, is some people could, like, laugh, like, oh, why are you, you know, wasting your time? Or people think, like, oh, hand porting or hand carving is, like, a waste of time, and you know, these people may own like a $2,000 pair of heads that are flowing like 250 CFM or something crazy, like AFR 165 or 185s or something like that. There's a lot of reasons. Number one, if you're like grassroots or poor on a budget, it doesn't matter. That's one angle. You could go to the pick and pull and probably find an F-150, like an OBS or a bullnose. Well, actually, bullnose is early for an E7, so basically OBS or early 90s. And, you find them, they're probably even cheaper at a pick and pull. Like, I paid $100 for this new pair that didn't need to be as machined and didn't have, like, bolts broken off in it, etc. But there's a bunch to think about going on. Like, there is that kind of age-old, not debate, but just kind of a thinking, how people think, like, built versus bought, and, people might kind of, like, look down on you for having either, like, an old engine. Like, the thing is, like, Mustangs and trucks in this era, even though they're now officially actually classic age, it's still not quite the prestige or like taste and class as a first generation Mustang. Like, I get that, but the reality is, like, even if you're doing this, for one thing, I'll say E7's are an amazing starter head to port because they bring so much more airflow over stock, and it's hard to really screw up as long as you follow some basic principles and areas, and stay safe from opening into your coolant water jackets. But the thing is, like, whether you have a 300 horsepower 302 that is ported and has like a stock cam, or like something closer to 400 that has a lot more done to it, is head porting or general porting, to me, in my opinion, as far as the whole engine building world, like blueprinting, like blueprinting. I love when people will say that about an engine. Oh, it's blueprinted. Like, I don't know if there were guys that built engines without doing that. Same as balancing. You have to balance a crankshaft. Like, that's kind of fundamental. So, maybe you have all Ford parts and you bolt it all together and your bearing clearances happen to fall within spec, right? Like, so you don't bother checking your, like your thrust bearing clearance or your main cap clearance, and so on, or like crankshaft end play, or even like your piston to wall clearance, and it could be large, and you may get like low oil pressure, or you just have a dummy oil pressure light, and it just happens to be enough oil pressure to come on. So blueprinting is one thing. Like, yeah, that's great, like people who built their engine. But the thing about porting is, once you get into this and understanding airflow dynamics and wet flow dynamics, the things that you'll learn when you're trying to do this right is pretty outstanding compared to the average, like car or truck person, especially someone who just buys a car or muscle sports car, whatever it is. Porting, in my opinion, is like on the next level, next to like either casting your own parts with CNC and billets, and maybe like custom ground cams. Like, it's on the upper deck of what you can do with internal combustion, at least with modifying a factory casting and so on. So the thing is as much shit as people could potentially talk or look down on you or laugh, is the reality is they likely don't necessarily understand or have the hands-on experience with an engine, to be able to have I guess you could say, oh, those bragging rights. Like, I'm not trying to say do it for that or to think that you're better than anyone. It's not that. It's that once you get to that level, you realize that they really realistically become kind of like clowns. Like, they can't really touch you as far as your knowledge of physics and what you've done to your own engine. So it's, you get someone with a Mustang, maybe they bought a crate engine, and they're kind of, they brag like, oh, we put this crate engine in off my crane and had to tune it and stuff, and okay, like an engine builder's thinking like, okay, yeah, cool, whatever. Like, but you didn't like so much as plastigauge your main caps or something, you know what I mean? And that's not even totally like that's low level blueprinting technically, but it's funny because you have those different levels, but when you get to the level of not only are you like blueprinting and making decisions on your full build, once you start porting and deciding how much CFM you're going to allow for that cam, and you could even have, maybe you ground your own cam, like that would be the ultimate, right? Like if you're porting and you have your own grind selection, like, or maybe you have someone else do it for you, but that's the thing, like you have that over anyone, like anyone with a brand new Corvette, Mustang, like, okay, maybe the brand new Corvette guy builds and ports engines for NASCAR Winston Cup engines or something, or works in a factory, but that's kind of rare. And here's the thing, like you know, I know we're in the era of 1,000 horsepower engines and stuff, and even like something like the Tesla Plaid with however many kilowatt hours, it's basically equivalent to like having 1,000 foot-pounds. Yeah, that's amazing and impressive. It's also super expensive, and I think what's funny is like something like this that arguably compared to an OHC, like as an OHV, is like it's basically a 400 horsepower small block. Arguably comparing something like this to modern still holds water, because back like when I was a teenager, like Fox bodies and stuff, or even my original Thunderbird only weighed 3,300 pounds. My Thunderbird, my MN12, my Super Coupe was considered like a pig, as far as weight. Like it could definitely move, but as far as its weight, like at 3,800, that was considered really heavy. Then the Charger came along at like 43, and now the Mustangs weigh almost 4,000, and Hellcats weigh like 43 or 44. So it's just kind of funny how that number has lost its value, like horsepower wise. And that big trucks now that have like 700 horsepower, like obviously trucks have definitely gotten heavier, don't get me wrong. They've probably put on like a good quarter ton. But my point is, like, if you want to compare a build like this, the original Iron 5.0 is comparing the power levels because of the high velocity of like just a 2-valve and smaller valves. Overall, like the power band on the low end, not just torque, like horsepower too is a product of it, but I've looked at dynos where an old Iron 5.0 or a built 302, it on average has like 15 foot-pounds and 10 horsepower more than, say, an original Coyote for every 100 RPM, right? So if you had identical cars on a road course, this engine would hold its own until, maybe the straightaways, obviously it's going to pull on those high RPMs unless you're really good, you do some really good blocking or something, but I think realistically for the street, like power band in the low end and torque is so important. Like I found that out from my Super Coupe because that's an engine that's basically the same bore and stroke as a 302, right, with teeny valves. And then you put a Roots blower on it, it has insane velocity, so it's making 100 more foot-pounds than horsepower, and it's peaking at like 3,000. And that thing with 373s, like it felt like you were driving around like a 460 or something. Like not the hottest 460, but it had the push that it felt like a big blocks power band or something. So the thing is like, yeah, in those 3,000 pound cars or something, like especially Fox bodies, you don't need more than 400 horsepower out of the factory castings. And my other point about that is you can unlock over 40 CFM off the intake, And if you're just going conservatively by 2 horsepower per CFM, like that's crazy. Like you can unlock almost 100 horsepower. I think they recently did that with a stroker, like a 347 or something. They unlocked like over 100 horsepower with just the factory castings ported out. I don't know what their valves were necessarily, but I have seen stock valve E7's go over 40 CFM on the intake. Exhaust is like, I think they pick up 20 or 30. But my point is like the fact that you can get something like this for free almost, learn what you're doing, buy less than $100 worth of tools, learn all you can. Like it's free. Like you could learn, you could definitely do this and clone my work and pick that power up for sure. I have a lot of people ahead of me, like people that I follow, people that I learn from. But that's all you've got to do is, you multiply that education into like your tooling. It takes a little finesse and talent in some of the areas, but it's just funny to me. Like it is kind of a class warfare thing. Like I know a lot of those people have crazy car payments, but my stuff is all bought and paid for. So if I could, like, if I had something like, say, an SN95 Mustang and I was cloning this build, that would be a really decent sports car. That's probably, looking at like an SN95 and how light it was, it's funny, if that came out now and they had like a Coyote level power in it, like people would think that was like the best sports car ever built, So it's kind of funny how times change. I get like safety's a factor, but can you imagine if the 90s Cobra had 700 horsepower? It would be lethal. It would be insane. So it's just kind of something to think about, like why to do this. There's a lot of reasons, not just the budget power, or if you're like kind of doing a grassroots thing, or even if you're in a class where you're not allowed to change the factory heads but you're allowed to port them. It's something to think about, but at the end of the day it's just a 302 V8. Like these aren't the greatest potential heads that exist nowadays, like in aftermarket offerings, but the fact that you can take a 302 and punch it out to like 400 with like a cam change and upping your valve train, and the blocks, they'll definitely handle that. A cast crank will still handle that. The only thing you need to do on an EFI like that is put, I don't know what the Mustangs have as far as like if they have like 190 liter per hour, but just basically a bigger fuel pump if it's external. And like 24-pound injectors, and you're good to go. You basically have, actually, if you want to compare apples and oranges, if you had an SN95, like a 94 or a Fox body Mustang, even a Fox T-Bird, and you did a build like this, like just port the E7's with a 3/4 cam, you would definitely beat a regular Mustang GT, just given the weight differences. Hell, you put like 411s with a build like this in a notchback or something, it's more than enough. So before you think like, oh, hand carving is a waste of time, those are the 3 things to think about. Like budget power, opening almost 100 horsepower on what came on your engine, and having the kind of, pride that goes with it, and kind of that like Ferrari level mystique to not just tell somebody, oh, I built that engine, I blueprinted it, and I also hand carved one of the most essential parts of it. And obviously you could port your intake and so on. I think that the Mustang EFI plenums are supposedly pretty lousy, so maybe get a GT40 version of that and then port it out. Or maybe you find a freaking Explorer with GT40s and you port those and have even more power. Now you could get well over 400. So it's just, there's a lot of reasons why to do it. I think that people may not get it. And I think anyone watching this video is already that entrenched or deep into like the world of an old Iron 5.0. And just for the record, I hate that they rebadged the new Mustang, because you can't just look up 5.0 anymore, which is sad. Like, you have to look up like 302 Windsor, or maybe like I get by on like 5.0 EFI, but it's just annoying because at one point Fox body Mustangs were actually synonymous with this engine as 5.0s. Like, oh, did you see that 5.0? Like, that's how this mighty, you know, engine was kind of a thing of, it was very common and almost annoying, right? Like, I feel like hearing 5.0, like, I love that sound of 5.0 with a welded muffler, like a 2-chamber, is one of the greatest sounds and engines. If not the greatest. I mean, there's a lot of V8 sound incredible. But there was something about the sound of a 302 with a like Flowmaster 40s or Thrush weldeds, but it's just funny that now it's like you never hear that sound. I think there's like a Corvette that drives up my street, like what is that generation? Third generation, like a 79 era. Like the Batmobile, I love those. But he's definitely got like welded mufflers. Like, that sound is so easy to pinpoint, and every time it goes up the street I have to look. I'm like, oh wait, that's such a rare item. But anyway, the point is, you can go back to that world and build something that's going to be able to compete with any modern engine. Any naturally aspirated V8, like, with some exceptions, like obviously the Ford Voodoo is, you know, you might want to get into stroker territory with that. You're going to need something more than E7's to compete with that. But as far as a lot of other things, it's totally worth it. Don't think about it, or don't let people who need to compensate for things kind of say, oh, that's not that much, or that's like, it's not true. And there's so many other things that you learn, like I said, in airflow dynamics and wet flow dynamics, that they will probably never really know because they didn't want to roll their sleeves up and get into it. But anyway, I'm out of tape anyway, but that's all for now. Just wanted to get into the roof and talk a little bit about porting in general. So, see you later.